3 in the afternoon, November the 17th, 1889. A steamship called the Alagoas sits in Guanabara Bay with its engines turning. On its deck stands a 63-year-old man with a white beard that reaches his chest. He has ruled Brazil for 58 years and 7 months. He has corresponded with Darwin, hosted Victor Hugo, attended more sessions of the French Academy of Sciences than most of its members. Mind, 48 hours ago, he was emperor of 8.5 million square kilometers. Now he is a passenger on a borrowed warship, surrounded by soldiers who will not meet his eyes. The streets of Rio de Janeiro are empty, not by coincidence. The provisional government has scheduled the departure for the early afternoon and discouraged public gathering along the waterfront. The Republic does not want the city to watch its emperor leave. The man's wife stands beside him. She has not stopped trembling since the soldiers came to the palace 2 nights ago. In 41 days, she will be dead. He doesn't know this. He carries a sealed farewell letter. It thanks them for everything and asks for nothing. The ship turns toward the open Atlantic. Behind it, the largest territory in South America passes into the hands of men who, 2 days earlier, were shouting, "Long live the Emperor." The woman beside him, Empress Teresa Cristina, will not survive the first 6 weeks of exile. She will die in Porto, Portugal, on December the 28th, whispering that she does not die of illness, but of sorrow. Pedro himself will last 2 years. He will die in a Paris hotel room at 12:35 in the morning, aged 66, with a packet of Brazilian soil sealed inside his coffin, soil he had collected from every province of the empire he lost. Their only surviving daughter, and Princess Isabel, the woman who signed the law that freed 700,000 enslaved people, will spend 32 years in a French chateau, waiting for permission to return. She will never receive it in time. She will die one day before the 32nd anniversary of the coup, age 75, without seeing Brazil again. Isabel's 3 sons will scatter across the battlefields of the First World War. Prince Louis, the heir to the abolished throne, will fight in the trenches of Flanders with the British Army, contract a bone disease that will consume him for 5 years, and die in Cannes at 42. Prince Antonio, the youngest, will earn the Military Cross as a captain with the Royal Canadian Dragoons, survive 4 years of war, and die in a London air crash 18 days after the armistice. He will be 37. Prince Pedro, the eldest, will renounce the throne to marry a woman he loves and become the only one of them to set foot in Brazil again. A century and a half later, an 85-year-old bachelor prince named Bertrand leads what remains of the imperial house from Sao Paulo. He is never married, he has no children. His heir presumptive is a 39-year-old management consultant living in London, whose elder brother was killed aboard Air France Flight 447 over the Atlantic in 2009. And the dynasty that ruled the largest nation in South America for 67 years now depends, for its continuation, on whether a man in a London flat decides to marry. If you're enjoying this, subscribing is the best way to support the channel. It's free, and it helps us keep going. The Empire of Brazil existed for 67 years, from 1822 to 1889. At its peak, it covered 8.5 million square kilometers, larger than the continental United States, and larger than every European empire's home territory combined. Its population in 1889 stood at approximately 14 million. It was the only stable constitutional monarchy in South America, and for most of the 19th century, it was the dominant power on the continent. Pedro II had been emperor since the age of 5. His father, Pedro I, abdicated in 1831 and sailed for Portugal, under leaving the boy in the hands of tutors and regents who raised him inside the Palácio de São Cristóvão at the Quinta da Boa Vista, a palace of over 200 rooms set in formal gardens in the north of Rio de Janeiro. He was declared of age at 14 and crowned at 15. By the time the Republic deposed him, his reign of 58 years and 7 months exceeded Queen Victoria's at that date. He was the longest reigning monarch in the Western Hemisphere. Sir Pedro was not a conventional sovereign. He spoke 14 languages fluently, including Arabic, Hebrew, Sanskrit, and Tupi. He maintained personal correspondences with Charles Darwin, Louis Pasteur, Richard Wagner, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Friedrich Nietzsche. He visited the laboratories of Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison, and was the first head of state to use a telephone. He attended scientific congresses across Europe and the Americas, funded archaeological expeditions, and translated Persian poetry into Portuguese, and kept a personal library of over 60,000 volumes. The French Academy of Sciences elected him an associate member, an honour he took more seriously than most of his diplomatic obligations. The physical infrastructure of the Brazilian monarchy matched its intellectual ambitions. The Pátio Imperial in central Rio served as the administrative seat. The Palácio de São Cristóvão was the family residence. The Summer Palace at Petrópolis, and built between 1845 and 1862 with Pedro's private funds, sat in the mountains above Rio, connected to the capital by the first paved road in Brazil. Princess Isabel maintained her own residence at the Palácio Guanabara, where she would sign the law that abolished slavery. The imperial crown commissioned for Pedro's coronation in 1841 was fashioned from 18-carat solid gold by the goldsmith Carlos Martin, obset with 639 diamonds and 77 pearls, weighing 1.95 kilograms. It sat on the head of a man who preferred to spend his evenings reading Longfellow. This was what the family left behind on the deck of the Alagoas. The 200 rooms, the 60,000 books, the 639 diamonds, the country that Pedro had governed since before he could read. Before the empire fell, Pedro had already buried most of the people he loved. He and Teresa Cristina had 4 children, 2 sons, both named Pedro, and 2 sons named Afonso. All 4 boys died in infancy or early childhood, the eldest at 17 months, the youngest at not quite 2 years. Only 2 daughters survived, Leopoldina, who died in 1871 at age 24 from typhoid fever, and Isabel, who became heir to the throne by default and by grief. The Paraguayan War consumed 5 years of Pedro's reign from 1864 to 1870. Brazil won, but at a cost of approximately 50,000 dead. The war exhausted the treasury, strained the emperor's health, and introduced a generation of military officers, including Deodoro da Fonseca and Floriano Peixoto, to the idea that they, not the civilian monarchy, were the true guardians of the nation. By the 1880s, Pedro's body was failing. He suffered from diabetes, chronic fatigue, and recurring bouts of depression following the deaths of close friends and advisors, while his physicians urged him to travel to Europe for treatment, and his extended absences, 3 trips between 1871 and 1888, required Isabel to serve as regent. During her 3rd regency, she committed the act that sealed the monarchy's fate. On May 13, 1888, Princess Isabel signed the Lei Áurea, the Golden Law, a 2-article statute that immediately and unconditionally abolished slavery in Brazil. Now the Chamber of Deputies had passed it 83-9. 700,000 enslaved people were freed in a single afternoon. Brazil became the last country in the Western Hemisphere to end the practice. Isabel was acclaimed as a Redentora, the Redemptress, and received a golden rose from Pope Leo XIII. She had written plainly of her conviction that slavery, being an attack against human freedom, was repugnant to her. So the plantation owners, who had been the monarchy's most reliable political base, felt betrayed. Within 18 months, they aligned with the Republican military officers who had been agitating since the Paraguayan War. The alliance that destroyed the empire was not ideological, it was transactional. The landowners wanted revenge, the officers wanted power. The emperor, 63 years old and increasingly detached, did not see it coming. The Republican Revolution was originally scheduled for November the 20th, 1889. It was moved forward 6 days by a fabricated rumour. On the evening of November the 14th, Major Frederico Solon de Sampaio Ribeiro told Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca that the government had issued a warrant for his arrest. The warrant did not exist, but Deodoro, who was 58 years old, sick with dyspnea, sat nursing a personal grudge against Gaspar da Silveira Martins, the man about to become head of the cabinet, and a rival who had competed with Deodoro for the affections of the Baroness de Triunfo, chose to act. On the morning of November the 15th, a Friday, Deodoro left his residence struggling to breathe, crossed the Campo de Santana, and rallied the troops of the 2nd Artillery Regiment. Recent scholarship suggests that what he actually shouted was not "Long live the Republic," but "Long live His Majesty the Emperor." At that point, Deodoro believed they were overthrowing only the cabinet. The Republic was an improvisation. The critical defection belonged to General Floriano Peixoto, commander of the garrison responsible for defending the palace. Floriano had the men and the position to crush the mutiny. He chose instead to join it. And the only casualty of the entire revolution was the Baron of Ladario, Minister of the Navy, who drew a pistol, which misfired, was shot 4 times, and survived. By afternoon, the cabinet was deposed and the Viscount of Ouro Preto arrested. At the City Hall of Rio de Janeiro, the journalist José do Patrocínio drafted the proclamation of the Republic of the United States of Brazil. The public learned of the change of government only on November the 16th, and Pedro was at Petropolis when the coup occurred. He returned to Rio believing the Republicans only wanted to replace the cabinet. He attempted to form a new ministry under the councillor José Antonio Saraiva. When he understood that Deodoro would accept no compromise, he said what became his most famous statement: "If it is so, it will be my retirement. I have worked too hard and I am tired. I will rest then." The Marquis of Tamandare begged to mount a naval counterattack. Pedro refused. He would not permit Brazilian blood to be shed on his behalf. The United States ambassador, Robert Adams Jr., described the scene in a dispatch dated November the 19th. The emperor was summoned from Petropolis and could hardly realize the situation. The ministry having resigned at midnight, he attempted to form a new one, whereupon he was made a prisoner in the palace, all communication denied, and the imperial family ordered to leave Brazil in 24 hours. His final written communication before departure read, "Absent then, with all the people of my family, I will keep Brazil the most fond memory, making fervent wishes for its greatness and prosperity." Of all the monarchies that fell in the 19th and 20th centuries, which do you think was overthrown with the least resistance? And was that strength or surrender? Let me know in the comments. The Provisional Government issued Decree No. 1 on November the 15th, establishing the Federative Republic. 1 day later, Decree No. 2 offered Pedro a subsidy of 5,000 conto de rei, a substantial sum intended to fund his establishment in Europe. Pedro refused it. He reportedly asked, "With what authority can you provide public money?" The formal banishment came 5 weeks later. Decreto numero 78A, signed on December the 21st, 1889, by all 8 members of the Provisional Government, contained 5 articles. Article 1 banished Dom Pedro de Alcântara and his entire family from Brazilian territory. Article 2 forbade him from owning real estate in Brazil and required the liquidation of all such property within 2 years. Article 3 revoked the subsidy offer. Article 4 cancelled all stipends and donations retroactive to November the 15th. Article 5 revoked all contrary provisions. In 1890, 13 separate auctions dispersed the furnishings, artwork, and personal belongings of the imperial house. The confiscated properties read like an inventory of a nation's memory. The Pato Imperial in central Rio, converted to a mail and telegraph office. The Palacio de San Cristovo, given to the National Museum. The Petropolis Palace, eventually made a public museum. The Palacio Guanabara, Isabel's personal residence, the building where she signed the Golden Law, seized by the state and converted into the seat of the governor of Rio de Janeiro, when the family filed a lawsuit for its return in 1895. That lawsuit, as of 2026, remains unresolved. It is one of the oldest active legal cases in Brazilian history. The Palacio Leopoldina, which had been Princess Leopoldina's residence, was confiscated and demolished outright in the 1930s. The one thing the Republic did not sell, melt, or auction was the imperial regalia. The crown of Pedro II, the crown of Pedro I, the imperial sceptre topped with the dragon of the House of Braganza, the golden pen used by Isabel to sign the abolition of slavery, all were locked in government vaults, untouched, for 54 years. In 1943, they were placed on permanent display at the Museu Imperial in Petropolis. They remain there today. 639 diamonds in a glass case, behind velvet ropes, in a building the family once owned. The Alagoas reached Lisbon on December the 7th. Since 1889, 20 days after departure, King Carlos of Portugal greeted the deposed emperor at the harbour. The family travelled on to Porto. And then, on December the 24th, Christmas Eve, the official notification of permanent banishment arrived. The decree they had heard rumoured was now confirmed in writing. They could never return. Empress Teresa Cristina, who had been physically fragile for years, she suffered from cardiac asthma and severe arthritis, collapsed. Now the news broke what was left of her. She had been born a princess of the two Sicilies, married Pedro by proxy at age 21, without ever having met him, and spent 46 years as Empress of Brazil. She had buried 4 infant sons. She had watched her husband lose his throne without raising a hand. And now she was told that the country she had served for half a century did not want her back. On December the 28th, 1889, Santa Teresa Cristina spoke her last words to the Baroness of Japura. She said she did not die of illness, but of sorrow and of regret. She said she missed her daughter and her grandchildren, that she could not embrace them for the last time. She called Brazil a beautiful land and said she could not return. She died that afternoon of respiratory failure leading to cardiac arrest. She was 67 years old. She had survived 41 days in exile. And Pedro buried her at the royal pantheon of the House of Braganza in the church of São Vicente de Fora in Lisbon. Then he left Portugal. He could not remain in a country where his wife was buried and his homeland was visible across the water. He moved first to Cannes, to the Hôtel Beau Séjour, then to Paris. He took a suite at the Hotel Bedford, 17 Rue de l'Arcade, in the 8th arrondissement, near the Church of La Madeleine. The hotel still exists. It is still run by the same Swiss family, the Beruts, who operated it in 1891. There are plaques on its facade commemorating 2 former guests, Pedro II, Emperor of Brazil, and Heitor Villa-Lobos, the composer. The emperor and the composer never met. They occupied the same rooms 60 years apart. Pedro's final years were quiet and diminishing. Having refused the Republican subsidy, he lived on very little. He sold personal assets, including portions of his library, one to sustain himself. He continued attending sessions at the French Academy of Sciences. It was the one routine he would not abandon. He wrote in his Journal of Dreams, in which he was permitted to return to Brazil. He wrote that he had no desire to return to the position he had occupied, especially not by means of conspiracy of any sort. On November the 23rd, 1891, he appeared at the Academy of Sciences for the last time. The following day, he noted in his diary the resignation of Deodoro da Fonseca as president of Brazil. 10:30. Deodoro has quit. He took a long drive in an open carriage along the Seine in freezing weather. He returned to the Hotel Bedford with a chill that deepened into pneumonia. On December the 2nd, his 66th birthday, there was no celebration. A priest said Mass at his bedside while his daughter Isabel, his son-in-law Gaston, and his grandchildren stood in the room. Now his condition worsened through December the 3rd and the 4th. He received last sacraments from the Abbé Le Rebours, curé of La Madeleine. At 12:35 in the morning on December the 5th, 1891, Pedro II died of acute pneumonia in the left lung. He was 66 years old. His last words were a prayer. "May God grant me these last wishes, peace and prosperity for Brazil." While the body was being prepared, and the Count d'Eu found a sealed package bearing a message in the Emperor's handwriting. It read, "It is soil from my country. I wish it to be placed in my coffin in case I die away from my fatherland." Inside was soil from every province of the empire. Pedro had carried it with him for 2 years. He had never mentioned it to anyone. He was dressed in a marshal's court dress uniform. The Order of the Southern Cross lay across his chest. The Order of the Golden Fleece hung at his neck. And a silver crucifix from Pope Leo XIII rested in his hands. 2 Brazilian flags covered his legs. The packet of soil was placed inside the coffin, as instructed. France honoured Pedro in a way Brazil would not. The Republican government in Rio had asked Paris to deny an official funeral and prohibit display of the imperial flag. France ignored both requests. Isabel accepted the French government's offer of a state funeral. Pedro held the Grand Cross of the Légion d'honneur, and that was sufficient. On December the 9th, 1891, the coffin departed the Hotel Bedford carried by 8 French soldiers, draped in the green and gold imperial flag. The funeral service at the Church of La Madeleine was attended by Francis II, former King of the 2 Sicilies, Isabella II, former Queen of Spain, Philippe, Comte de Paris, General Joseph Bruguère representing President Sadi Carnot, the presidents of both chambers of the French Parliament, so nearly the entire membership of the Institut de France, and figures including Alexandre Dumas Fils and the Portuguese novelist Eça de Queiroz. Representatives from across Europe, the Ottoman Empire, China, Japan and Persia were present. Between 200,000 and 300,000 people lined the funeral route in the rain. 80,000 French troops marched in the procession. 2 carriages carried nearly 200 wreaths, and including one from Queen Victoria inscribed simply, "To Dom Pedro, Victoria Armon." There was no delegation from Brazil. Pedro was interred on December the 12th at the Royal Pantheon of the House of Braganza, São Vicente de Fora, Lisbon, beside his wife. Princess Isabel was 43 years old when her father died. She had already lost her country. She would spend the next 30 years losing everything else. In the first years of exile, the family's finances were fragile. They stayed at hotels and rented villas in Cannes. After Pedro's death, Isabel and her husband Gaston, the Count d'Eu, purchased a villa in Boulogne-sur-Seine. When Gaston's father, the Duke of Nemours, died in 1896, Gaston inherited property and the family's situation stabilised. In 1905, Gaston purchased the Château d'Eu in Normandy, the historic residence of his grandfather, King Louis-Philippe I of France, and it became their permanent home. When Isabel transformed the chateau into what visitors described as an informal embassy of Brazil, she received every Brazilian who passed through France, maintained correspondence with political figures in Rio, and reportedly assisted the young aviator Alberto Santos Dumont in his early experiments with flight. Her 3 sons, Pedro, Luis and Antonio, were educated at the Theresian Military Academy in Wiener Neustadt, Austria, trained as officers in a profession their exile made theoretical. And they were princes of a country that no longer had a throne, educated for a military they were not permitted to join. Then came the war, and the war took 2 of them. Prince Antonio, the youngest, enlisted with the Royal Canadian Dragoons and was attached to the Royal Flying Corps as an intelligence officer. He was promoted to captain in 1916 and awarded the Military Cross in 1917. He survived 4 years of the deadliest conflict in human history to that date. And on November the 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed. 18 days later, on November the 29th, he was killed in an airplane crash in Edmonton, London. He was 37 years old. He never married. He left no descendants. He was buried at the Royal Chapel of Dreux, the Orléans family mausoleum in France. Isabel had buried her youngest child. 14 months later, she buried her second. Prince Louis had been barred from the French army by an 1886 law prohibiting members of former ruling families from serving. He enlisted instead with the British forces and fought in Flanders. In 1915, in the trenches, he contracted a virulent bone rheumatism from which he never recovered. He received the Belgian Military Medal of the Isère, the French Légion d'honneur, the Croix de Guerre, and several British decorations. And none of them prevented what the disease was doing to his body. He spent the final years of his life in Cannes, in declining health, watching the war end and knowing it had ended him. He died on March the 26th, 1920, at the age of 42. His funeral was attended by King Albert I of Belgium and King Manuel II of Portugal. He left behind 3 children: Pedro Enrique, aged 10, Luis Gaston, aged 8, and Pia Maria, aged 6. On September the 3rd, my 1920 President Epitácio Pessoa signed Decreto 4120, revoking the banishment of the imperial family. The exile that had lasted 31 years was officially over. Rui Barbosa, one of the original signatories of the Banishment Decree, had already said that those who created the Federal Republic had no claims against the ashes of the old emperor, whose virtues were much higher than his faults. Then the president used a gold quill provided by the Brazilian Press Association for the signing ceremony. Isabel received the news at the Château d'Eu. She was 74 years old. She was too ill to travel. On November the 14th, 1921, one day before the 32nd anniversary of the coup that had taken her country, Princess Isabel died at the Château d'Eu of influenza, complicated by pneumonia. She was 75. And she had freed 700,000 people and spent 32 years in exile for it. The Brazilian government ordered 3 days of national mourning, honours reserved for a head of state. Her husband, the Count d'Eu, survived her by 10 months. On August the 28th, 1922, he died aboard the French steamship Massilia, which was carrying him to Rio de Janeiro for the centenary of Brazilian independence. He died at sea off the Brazilian coast. He was 80 years old. But he had not seen Brazil in 33 years. He died within sight of the shore he could not reach. The 3 sons of Isabel each took a different path through exile, and each path led to loss. Prince Pedro de Alcântara, the eldest, was born on October the 15th, 1875. He had a congenital defect in his left arm from birth complications. His own father, the Count d'Eu, assessed him privately as always notable for laziness and ineptness, and he was not built for the role that exile assigned him. On October the 30th, 1908, Pedro signed a formal renunciation of his dynastic rights at Cannes. He wanted to marry Countess Elizabeth Dobrzyński de Dobrzyńsk, a Bohemian noblewoman of non-royal blood. The renunciation stated it was binding for himself and for all his descendants. Princess Isabel confirmed it in writing, recognizing her second son Louis as the new heir. And that single document would divide the dynasty for more than a century. Pedro married Elizabeth on November the 14th, 1908 at Versailles. They had 5 children, including a daughter, Isabel, who married the Orleanist pretender to the French throne, and a son, Pedro Gaston, who would later repudiate his father's renunciation and fracture the family permanently. Pedro returned to Brazil in the 1930s and settled at the Palacio do Grão-Pará in Petrópolis, and he became a familiar local figure, a quiet, amiable man who had given up a theoretical crown for an actual marriage and seemed content with the exchange. On January the 29th, 1940, he collapsed from cardiopulmonary arrest after returning from the cinema. He was 64 years old. President Getúlio Vargas granted him a head of state funeral. He was the only prince of Brazil to die in his homeland. Subscribing takes 5 seconds and helps this channel reach more people. And that's all. Prince Louis, the second son, was born on January the 26th, 1878. After his brother's renunciation, he became the heir to the abolished throne. He married Princess Maria Pia of Bourbon-II Sicilies on November the 4th, 1908, a fully royal match that satisfied the dynastic requirements his brother had abandoned. He led the monarchist campaign from exile, organising correspondence networks and petitioning for the restoration of the monarchy through legal channels. Barred from the French army, he enlisted with the British and fought in Flanders. In the trenches, he contracted the bone rheumatism that would kill him. The disease consumed 5 years. He spent them between hospitals and convalescent homes in southern France, each season weaker than the one before. He died in Cannes on March the 26th, 1920. He was 42. Among his 3 children were Pedro Henrique, who would become head of the imperial house at age 12, Luis Gaston, who would die at 20 in 1931, and Pia Maria, who would outlive them both. Prince Antonio, the youngest, was born on August the 9th, 1881. He served as a lieutenant with the Royal Canadian Dragoons, rose to captain, and was attached to the Royal Flying Corps. He was awarded the Military Cross in 1917. He survived the Western Front. And he did not survive peace. On November the 29th, 1918, in Edmonton, London, an airplane crash ended his life. He was 37. He never married. He left no descendants. He was the youngest of Isabel's sons, the last to see her alive, and the first of her children to die. The dynastic split that defines the imperial family today traces back to one document: Pedro de Alcántara's renunciation of 1908. In the 1940s, after Pedro de Alcántara's death, then his eldest son, Prince Pedro Gaston, formally repudiated his father's renunciation. His argument was constitutional. The renunciation had never been ratified by the Brazilian Parliament, as required by Article 43 of the 1824 Imperial Constitution. Since the monarchy had been abolished in 1889, Pedro Gaston argued there was no longer any constitutional mechanism to enforce the renunciation. It was, in his view, a private family letter with no legal standing. Opposing him was Prince Pedro Henrique, son of Prince Louis, grandson of Isabel, who'd been recognised as head of the imperial house since Isabel's death in 1921, when he was 12 years old. Pedro Henrique maintained that the renunciation was valid and had been confirmed by Isabel herself in writing. The family split into 2 branches. The Vassouras branch, descended from Pedro Henrique, took its name from the city of Vassouras in Rio de Janeiro state, where the family settled in the 1960s. The Petrópolis branch, descended from Pedro Gaston, is named for Petrópolis, where they occupy the Palacio do Grão-Pará. The majority of Brazilian monarchists and most foreign royal houses recognize the Vassouras line as the legitimate imperial house. Pedro Henrique bridged the exile era and the modern period. Born in France in 1909 and educated at Sciences Po and the Sorbonne, he married Princess Maria Elizabeth of Bavaria at Nymphenburg Palace on August 19, 1937. He came to Brazil in 1945, settled in Vassouras, and was active in the monarchist movement until his death on July 5, 1981. He had 12 children. One died in infancy, creating the large Vassouras dynasty that exists today. His eldest son, Prince Luis, succeeded him as head of house. The Petropolis branch today is headed by Prince Pedro Carlos, born in 1945. He lives at the Palacio do Grão-Pará in Petropolis and manages the Companhia Imobiliária de Petrópolis, which collects a 2.5% laudamio tax on every property sale in Petropolis. A concession dating to the 1930s that generates steady income from the city Pedro II built as a summer retreat. So Pedro Carlos has stated publicly, "I believe that we are Republicans because we need to adapt ourselves to reality." The 1988 Brazilian Constitution contained an extraordinary provision. Article 2 of the Transitory Constitutional Provisions mandated a national plebiscite on the form and system of government, the first time since 1889 that the Brazilian people would be asked whether they wanted a republic or a monarchy. And the date was set for April 21, 1993, Tiradentes Day. The plebiscite was held under President Itamar Franco during a period of hyperinflation that exceeded 2,400% annually. The ballot posed two questions: republic or monarchy, and presidentialism or parliamentarism. The result was decisive. 43,881,747 Brazilians voted for the republic. 6,790,751 voted for the monarchy. The split was 86.6% to 13.4%. Turnout reached 73.4% of 90 million registered voters. Monarchists pointed out that the Superior Electoral Court had barred members of the imperial family from appearing in free television campaign slots. At its peak in 1992, polling had shown monarchist support at 22%. It didn't hold. The people chose the republic. For the first time in 104 years they were asked, and they said no. Today, the head of the Imperial House of Brazil is Prince Bertrand of Orléans-Braganza, born on February 2, 1941. He is 85 years old. He is never married. He has no children. He succeeded his brother Prince Luis, who died on July 15, 2022, also unmarried and without children, and after leading the house for 41 years. Bertrand is connected to tradition, family and property, an ultra-conservative Catholic organisation, and is an active spokesman for the Imperial House, giving lectures and appearing at monarchist events across Brazil. His heir presumptive is Prince Rafael Antonio of Orléans-Braganza, born on April 24, 1986. Rafael is 39 years old, an engineer educated at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, and currently co-owns a consulting firm in London. He is unmarried. He is reportedly seeking a dynastic match in accordance with family tradition. Rafael was not always the heir. His elder brother, Prince Pedro Luis, born in 1983, worked at BNP Paribas in Luxembourg. On June 1, 2009, Pedro Luis boarded Air France Flight 447 in Rio de Janeiro, bound for Paris. The Airbus A330 disappeared over the Atlantic Ocean, and all 228 people on board were killed. He was 26 years old. The man who would have carried the dynasty into the next generation lies at the bottom of the Atlantic. Of Pedro Henrique's 12 surviving sons, only 3 maintain their succession rights: Luis, Bertrand, and Antonio. 5 brothers renounced their rights to marry commoners. Prince Antonio, Rafael's father, died on November 8, 2024, at age 74, died of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, making Rafael the sole direct heir. The most politically active descendant of the imperial family has never been in the line of succession. Prince Louis Philippe of Orléans-Braganza, born in 1969, is the son of Prince Eudes, who renounced his dynastic rights to marry a commoner. Louis Philippe holds a master's degree from Stanford and an MBA from INSEAD. In 2018, he became the first descendant of the imperial family to hold political office since 1889, elected as a federal deputy for São Paulo with over 118,000 votes. He was re-elected in 2022 with more than 236,000. He was nearly Jair Bolsonaro's running mate in 2018. He has over 900,000 followers on Instagram. He is a prince who sits in Congress but can never sit on a throne. Sat at the Palacio de San Cristóvão, where Pedro II was born, where the family lived, where the National Museum was housed for 126 years, caught fire on the evening of September 2nd, 2018. The blaze consumed approximately 92.5% of 20 million items. The Empress Teresa Cristina collection, 700 artifacts from Pompeii, Herculaneum and Etruscan sites, assembled by Pedro II personally, was largely destroyed. The Egyptian collection, the largest in South America, melted. The numismatic collection fused into shapeless drops of blackened metal. Frescoes that had survived the eruption of Vesuvius didn't survive the neglect of a republic that had forgotten to maintain the building's fire hydrants. 2 nearby hydrants had insufficient water pressure the night of the fire. The building was uninsured. The 5.8-ton Bendigo meteorite survived intact. The 11,500-year-old skull of Lucia was recovered in fragments. The crown jewels were never in the building. They remain at the Museu Imperial in Petropolis. The crown of Pedro II, 18-carat gold, 639 diamonds, 77 pearls behind glass, in a room that was once the emperor's private study. In 1921, the remains of Pedro II and Teresa Cristina were brought home aboard the dreadnought São Paulo and received in Rio de Janeiro on January 8th. A national holiday was declared. The historian Pedro Calmon recorded that elderly people cried, many knelt, and all clapped. The remains were eventually placed in the imperial mausoleum at the Cathedral of São Pedro de Alcântara in Petropolis, inaugurated by President Vargas on December 5th, 1939, the 48th anniversary of Pedro's death. Isabel and the Count d'Eu were repatriated from France in 1953 and formally interred in the mausoleum on May 5th, 1971. The family that the Republic expelled in 1889 was reunited underground in the city Pedro built as his summer home. Recent polling places monarchist support in Brazil at approximately 10.7%, roughly consistent with the 1993 plebiscite result. No serious institutional movement toward restoration exists. A 2017 petition on the Senate website for a new referendum gathered 32,000 signatures, surpassing the required threshold, but was rejected by the responsible committee. The movement remains a small minority, visibly aligned with Brazil's broader conservative wave, but lacking the political mass to change anything fundamental. Prince Raphael of Orléans-Braganza lives in London. He is the great-great-great-grandson of the man who ruled 8.5 million square kilometres for 58 years and died in a Paris hotel room at 12:35 in the morning with a packet of Brazilian soil inside his coffin. Raphael works in consulting. He carries the name Pedro in his full baptismal name. He is, and by the reckoning of the house he was born into, the heir to the imperial throne of Brazil. He has never sat on a throne. Neither did his father, neither did his grandfather, neither did his great-grandfather. The dynasty is 137 years removed from a country that voted, when given the chance, to keep it that way.